Straight away, the best title of any Frankenstein film, so we're off to a positive start. Hi guys, so at the weekend I watched Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. Not my first watch of the movie. I did see it about 4 years ago and I remembered really enjoying it, so I was looking forward to going back for a second time. Peter Cushing returns in this to play Frankenstein for the 6th time. He wasn't in the film before this one, so in the horror of Frankenstein they brought in a younger actor called Ralph Bates to play a kind of younger, sexier version of the character. I guess at the time maybe they thought Peter Cushing had had his day. But for whatever reason, they decided not to continue with the Ralph Bates version. For this one, they brought back Cushing. And I think that was a sensible choice because I think you get a more satisfying finale for Cushing's Frankenstein at the end of this film than you do at the end of his previous one, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. We also get Terence Fisher back in the directing chair, which I think was very apt given his long history with Hammer and the Frankenstein films. In addition to Cushing, there are 2 other actors in this who I personally recognised from other films, albeit I didn't actually recognise them while I was watching the film. I just recognised them when I checked the cast list afterwards. One of those people is Madeline Smith. Now, it's disgraceful really that I didn't recognise this woman while I was watching this, because it was only about 3 months ago that I was watching The Vampire Lovers, and I even did a review on the film. Somehow, despite that, I did not recognise Madeline Smith in Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. What makes it even worse is the fact that I'm a big James Bond fan. I must have seen Madeline Smith's scene in Live and Let Die about 20 times over the years, but for whatever reason, I just can't recognise this girl in anything whenever I see her in something I've not seen her in before. She's a very beautiful woman with a very beautiful face, but she's got a very indistinguishable face as well. It's kind of plain in a way. It's gorgeous, but it's not an easy face to remember. I don't know if she's back in her heyday. Maybe she just used to change her makeup and her eyeliner slightly from film to film, or maybe it's just me, but it's just weird. I can never pick her out of a lineup, but she's in this, and also Bernard Lee is in the film. He does a little cameo. He plays one of the inmates, but again, I didn't recognise him, which is bizarre given the fact that I've seen him play M in the Bond films like hundreds of times. But yeah, he's playing an inmate. We see one scene of him in his cell. So this film does actually take place in an asylum, a brand new setting for the series, and we get a nice continuity from Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed coming into this film. We don't always get, in a Frankenstein, a clear link to the previous one, but here we kind of do. So we're sort of left to presume that Frankenstein got out of the fire at the end of the previous film. He either crawled out or he was dragged out, but he wasn't able to just flee. He was arrested and put into this asylum for the criminally insane. Great place for him, in my opinion, but it wasn't long before he was able to turn that situation to his advantage, because it turns out that the people in charge of this asylum are a little bit corrupt. Well, a lot corrupt, actually. The director likes to rape the inmates, the guards like to abuse the inmates, and somehow Frankenstein managed to get some evidence of this that he could use to blackmail these people, and all he wants in exchange is to be allowed out of his cell and be given his own big private wing of the asylum where he can carry on his experiments again. So he's actually in a better position in this film geographically than he's probably been in any other Frankenstein film since the original, when he had his anonymity. And he's also got a couple of helpers in this. So there's a character called Simon who helps him. This is somebody who starts out this film trying to copy Frankenstein in the outside world, but he gets arrested and put into the same asylum as Frankenstein, which is very lucky for the plot. And also there's a character called Sarah, also known as the Angel, who plays an inmate in this. We never find out why she's in the asylum, and come to think of it, we never find out why she's willing to help Frankenstein with all this evil stuff, but she does anyway. So Frankenstein is in a good place. Geographically, he's got 2 helpers, and we're all set for more fun and games, evil and destruction. Peter Cushing wears this really strange blonde toupee in this film, and it took me a while to figure out what that's all about, because This character is not really somebody who would just think to nip down the barbers and get himself a new look. He's not that sort of person. This is somebody who barely remembers to eat half the time. So I've sort of come to the conclusion that this messy looking wig that Cushing's got in this is just a little nod to Frankenstein must be destroyed. I kind of feel like the character's head must have been really badly singed by that experience or something, to the point where even Frankenstein would feel the need to do something cosmetically about the way that the top of his head looks. So I think that's the reason for that. And if it is, it's a really clever touch, actually. Something else I like about this, Frankenstein has these burns on his hands, presumably from the same fire. And what this means is that he can no longer operate as a surgeon, because when you're doing an operation, you have to be extremely precise. You need really steady hands. And I guess the nerves in his hands have just been affected to the point where he just shakes too much. He can't do that kind of stuff anymore. So he's very dependent on Simon and Sarah for help in this film, and this just gives Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell a different dynamic that we've not had before. That's what I really like about this sequel. It doesn't just give you the same film that we've had many times before. It keeps the character moving forward. Something irreversible has happened to him here that's never going to change again, and I just like that bold move. Plus it means that this film doesn't end up feeling too similar to The Revenge of Frankenstein, where the character had a male helper who was all for the experiments. He's kind of got that again here with Simon, but he's much more dependent on Simon, I think, than he ever was with, was it Hans in the second film? There's an ingenious moment in this where Simon is operating on the creature, doing lots of complicated stuff. He's a doctor in his own right, Simon, so he knows what he's doing, but even so, Frankenstein's hovering around him like a conductor at an orchestra, telling him what to do and just keeping his eye on everything. But there's a moment where Simon is doing something on the monster's wrist and he can't work the arteries. He just hasn't got enough hands. So Frankenstein steps in to help, but he doesn't trust his own hands. So he gets down on his hands and knees and puts one of the arteries in his mouth and just sits there like with this artery in his teeth while Simon does what he needs to do. And Frankenstein just looks so comically stupid in this moment, and yet it's absolutely believable for the character that he's still, after all this time, learned absolutely nothing. His work has cost him greatly in terms of his hands, and yet he's still determined to press on. He'll do completely stupid and silly things like getting on his hands and knees and doing that with his teeth. But it's a moment in this film I absolutely love. Allegedly Cushing's idea on set, although unconfirmed, but just brilliant. Another good nod to previous films, I think, albeit this might be an accident. Frankenstein's lab in this film looks extremely neat and tidy. There's lots of space for the characters to move around in. It doesn't seem like there's as much equipment as normal. Now, this could be down to Hammer's cost-cutting in the 70s. Supposedly this film was made on something of a budget, even by Hammer's standards, but I like to think it was deliberate because it works for the story that there would be less equipment in this asylum. Because if you think about it, if you go back to the first film, Frankenstein had this lab where, he had Bunsen burners and beakers full of acid and like windmills, and, he was running around pulling this lever, and then he had to run around the room and pull another lever, and Paul was doing something, and it was all very chaotic, but you could understand it because it was his first time doing the experiments. But it stands to reason that after 6 films, he would have streamlined the whole process. He would have found ways to make the whole thing more economical over time, plus technology would have been advancing over the course of this 15, 20-year period. So you get to this film, suddenly he's not using as much stuff. But I think that's a nice bit of respect paid to everything that's come before. This film does that very well. It's a very thoughtful film when it comes to what's come before, and yet at the same time, it's still a film that's absolutely standing on its own 2 feet. I love the actual asylum itself in this as well. It feels like its own character. So cost-cutting there may have been on this project, but the production design is still of an extremely high standard. Plus, the sets in this feel very specific to this movie. Sometimes when you're watching a Hammer film, even a really good one, it does feel like they are regurgitating sets from other movies, and they are a lot of the time. Like, for example, you could be watching a really good Dracula Hammer film, and even though Dracula's castle might look tip-top, and in terms of all the effort they've put in, you still might spot the occasional staircase or room that's just been turned around and reused from the Reptile or Rasputin or something like that. But I don't think there's as much chance of you spotting something like that in this movie. I would put money on that. I just feel like the asylum setting in this film is very exclusive and very much a one-off, but it looks so good. And it's claustrophobic as well. There's a sequence where Frankenstein and his helpers, they're just going room to room because of reasons, and we get to see just how small the inmates' rooms are. They're tiny, and the windows are too high to see out of. It must have been horrific to live in one of these rooms. I could imagine people, even if they went to an asylum like this innocent, give it 2 or 3 months and they would be just as crazy as everybody else. And there are times when we just flick to one of the inmates' rooms to see their reaction to Frankenstein's monster doing a distant roar, and you get some funny reactions amongst the inmates. So there's this one woman, it just seems to amuse her that Frankenstein's up to no good, and she does this little cackle like a witch, and I think she says something at some point like, "You go get him, sweetie," or something like that. There's another person though, a guy, and whenever we cut to him, he's just absolutely terrified in his cell. This is probably a genuinely really crazy person who's not normally afraid of anything, but he's afraid of Frankenstein's monster. And the sound design in the asylum is fantastic. You don't get a good thumping, memorable theme tune like you get in The Curse of Frankenstein, but you do get this backing track of like inmates just wailing and carrying on like they're apes at a zoo. You can just hear them in the distance, like just making noises, crazy noises, and they're at it all the time, but it just makes the place feel really unsettling. And something else that crossed my mind as well is that this place is dangerous from just so many angles. Like, the inmates are presented almost as a kind of zombie horde throughout this film. Not people dangerous on their own, but together, very much so. You know, I was reminded watching this of The Revenge of Frankenstein, when Frankenstein's patients from his clinic just randomly overran him and as a group just basically tore him to pieces. There's the feeling throughout this film that could happen again, and it kind of does to one character. I won't give away who, but so you've got the inmates who are dangerous, the staff are dangerous, the warden's dangerous in a very slimy, horrible way, actually. Frankenstein's monster's probably the most dangerous of all. Even Frankenstein himself is dangerous. He always is. And he does his usual thing in this movie of being that lovable rogue type character. You know, you can't help liking him because of all of his charm and wit. And yet he's clearly a very bad man. And he does something in this that he does in a lot of the other Frankenstein movies, actually, which is absolutely have you on his side for like 2/3 of the movie. And then he just pushes it too far. He just goes over the line. So in the first movie, I guess it was the moment where he has the maid killed, where you kind of think to yourself, oh God, I'm not sure I should be really supporting you and following you and being on your side with all this. Frankenstein must be destroyed. Similar sort of thing. Even though he's blackmailing people in that movie, being all dastardly, he gets to that moment where he rapes that one character, and then you're like, oh, I feel guilty now for liking you as a character. And you get that in this film as well. You can't help be on his side for most of it, and then he comes up with this ridiculous scheme to mate Sarah with the monster, and you're thinking, wow, that is just really obscene. So this character, part of the ingenuity of him is that there's like a line and he's constantly crossing over it but then coming back because of his with all of his wit and charm, but then he'll do something so bad that he's clearly crossed the line again. If there was a poster for this movie or a lot of the other Frankenstein movies, it should just say something like, get ready to root for the bad guy because you will. And I actually did see that on a movie poster once. It wasn't a Frankenstein movie, I just can't remember what it was. The creature design here is absolutely exceptional. I still think that the all-time best Frankenstein's monster is the Christopher Lee one from The Curse of Frankenstein, but this version is arguably the most dangerous looking. I mean, this ape-type thing looks absolutely formidable. You wouldn't want to be stood in its way. I do find it ironic that even though Frankenstein has clearly streamlined his operations, the results of those operations seem to be going backwards. Like, this is easily the least presentable creature he's come up with in any of these films. And let's not forget the actual objectives of this science, which is to produce a human being which looks so lifelike that the rest of the world would then look on and think, oh, this is actually a project worth pursuing. Let's make it legal. Let's fund Frankenstein to do further experiments and so forth. But I think the only reaction the Baron would get when showing this creature would just be an immediate order for the police to shoot him down, because he just literally looks like he might have come from hell. I don't have any negatives really for this film. I'd have to really get into nitpicking mode to produce anything. There is a distant shot of the asylum that looks a little bit dodgy, mainly because they show it so often. Like the first time you see this shot, it looks pretty good. But the trouble is they put it on screen so often that eventually you notice it's a model, and then by the time you get to like the final time you see it, you start to notice little, giveaway signs that there's a painting there and so on. I just think they needed the camera to linger less on this thing. And I guess the other thing I might be tempted to mention is that the character of Sarah at times is a little bit weak, mainly because they've made her mute. The second time in this series we've had a mute woman by Frankenstein's side. I don't think it's the same character, but it's just a strange choice that they've made here to make Sarah mute. And it's a little bit old-fashioned, isn't it? I mean, if you had a movie now where you've got these two intelligent scientists talking about, bringing a creature back to life, and then by their side you've got one woman who is mute and therefore contributes nothing to all this, it just wouldn't be very 2023, would it? But I think this is just the way things were in the 70s. You could have a situation like this and people wouldn't overthink it as much as maybe we would nowadays. It was a little bit similar when I was talking about The Vampire Lovers, that other big Hammer film that Madeline Smith was involved in. There's a lot of old-fashioned views towards lesbianism that creep through in that film. I think that film would be made a lot different if it was done today. But I don't want to get too hung up on the little odd things I don't like about Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. For the most part, it's an excellent sequel. It's an excellent way to wrap this series up, and I absolutely love it. I think it's great. Right, before we get to the Bag of Terror, I'll quickly show you the version of the film that I've got for this. Here is my Blu-ray copy of Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. It's probably one of the best ones I've got this of Hammer's. It's a 3-disc set. It's got one Blu-ray, one DVD, and one extras disc, I think, or it's an extras disc just for the Blu-ray side of things. I'm not entirely sure, but it's got a lot of stuff on it. It's got a commentary track by Marcus Hearn. I think he's like a film historian or film commentator, and also two actors from the film, Shane Bryant and Madeline Smith. So they play Sarah and Simon. They did this track 39 years after shooting the movie, and it's great to hear them talk about the movie on this. I did watch the commentary track the night after I watched the movie at the weekend, and absolutely delightful track. Lots of cool stories about the movie. There is also a documentary about the film, which I've not watched, and also a documentary about Terence Fisher. It's loaded with features, this particular set. I think this was quite expensive when I first bought it, because I just don't think there were that many copies available of it on eBay, so the price was really high. But I think since I've got this, I think they've released another 3-disc set or multi-disc set of this film, so it's not as rare anymore. So I think you might be able to get a price, but there's definitely two really good versions out there, one more recent than the other. Right, let's get to the Bag of Terror and see what sort of score I've got for this. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5 bloody axes out of 5. Definitely one of the best Hammer films, I think. Just absolutely superb. Had a really good time with it the other night. But that does bring us to the end of our run of Frankenstein reviews. I will now have to turn my attentions over to the other Hammer films I've not yet covered, and I think my next one will possibly be one of the prehistoric Hammer films that I've not yet watched. I can't remember the title of it, but I've got my eye on one. But anyway, that's for another day. For now, I'll thank you for joining me, and I will say cheerio, bye-bye.